Let's learn in this video how to create an Azure virtual machine using the portal. When you create a virtual machine, there will be multiple other Azure resources that should be created as part of that virtual machine dependencies. First of which, we would have the operating system disk, and then we would have the data disk where we can attach one or multiple data disks. The virtual machine would have also a network interface card that will be attached to a subnet within a virtual network. And then we can expose that Azure virtual machine publicly to be able to access through RDP or through SSH. For that, we can provision a public IP address to access that VM. Let's see how this works from the Azure portal. So from here, I'll go to switch to my Azure subscription. And from here, I'll go to the menu, the hamburger menu, and then I'll go to create a new resource. And from there, I will find the most, let's say, the most famous or the most popular Azure services. And one of them is the virtual machines. So I'll go to create a new virtual machine. And here we would have multiple steps actually to go to create and configure that virtual machine, from managing the basics, the attaching the disks, managing the networking, the monitoring, and so on. Let's start first with the basics, where we can choose here, as for any Azure resource, we should choose the right subscription. So select your own subscription where you're going to create that virtual machine, and then choose the resource groups. So either you choose an existing resource group, or we can go to create a new resource group. So for here, I'll go to create a new one. I call it RG-VM-Win11, because here I know I will go to create a Windows 11 virtual machine in Azure. And the resource group, actually, that's a logical isolation between the different resources in Azure. So if I go to click OK there, then I go to give a name for my virtual machine. I'll just call it VM-Win11. And then I choose the region for my virtual machine. So each resource in Azure, because Azure is available in multiple locations around the world, we can choose in which location to deploy those resources. So in my case here, I go to choose West Europe, for example. And then for the availability options, I have actually 4 options. First is to choose no infrastructure redundancy required. So this is the default value. And then we have the availability zone. If I choose that, for example, I will have here, I can choose one availability zone for my virtual machine. So in each Azure region, and most of them actually, we have 1 or 2 or 3 availability zones, and we can choose one of these availability zones to host my virtual machine. Okay. And the other option that we have here is the virtual machine scale set, and with this option you can create multiple replica of this virtual machine that will share the same configuration. Or you can use also the availability set, which is let's say the old version of VMSS. For this demo, I'll continue with no infra redundancy required, and then in security type, I'll go continue with the standard. Otherwise, you'd have other options for the trusted launch virtual machines or the confidential virtual machines. For the image here, so in this list I have few of them, but note we already have a large list of available OSs. So we have Linux and Windows. For Linux we have Ubuntu, SUSE, Red Hat, Oracle Linux, Debian, and for Windows we have actually both Windows servers and also Windows 11 and Windows 10. If I go here to click all the images, here we would have a surprise. Actually, we don't have not just those few images, we have in Azure 4,876 images available for me. For some other Azure subscriptions, you might see less or even more than this number. It depends on your Azure subscription, whether that is pay-as-you-go, MSDN subscription, or an enterprise subscription. So you would see a different set of available virtual machines available for you. Those VMs, they have different operating systems. So we can view here, we can go down to Windows Server 2008, 2012, 16, 19, 2022. We can go to choose CentOS, Debian, Red Hat, SUSE, Ubuntu, and many more. Okay. Those VMs are actually either published either by Microsoft or by some partners of Microsoft, okay, like Debian and so on. Those images are, they could be categorized actually in three categories: the x64 with Gen 1 and Generation 2, or the ones that are using ARM64 based CPU. So here we have large list of available virtual machines, whether that is just a virtual machine or a virtual machine with a database engine like SQL Server, for example, or like with Oracle, or some others that might contain some other tools like Visual Studio and so on. So if you go here to next, you will see actually a large list of available VMs. In my demo today, I want to work with Windows 11. So if I choose here Windows 11, if I go to select right here, I will see a large list of Windows 11 versions. So I'll go to choose, let's say, the best version for a developer. That should be the Windows 11 Pro Professional, the latest per today as I'm recording this video, which is 22H2 Gen 2 x64. Once I choose that virtual machine, here it will show me that that VM actually works only for x64, doesn't work for ARM64, because that depends actually on the VM there. But it's okay for me. I'll continue with x64. And then we have the option here for running an Azure Spot discount. What this is, so Azure Spot discount, that's let's say the unused computing in the Azure data centers. Azure will provide you the option to use that available computing capacity at a very reduced price, or at a discount that can go down or up to 60 or 70 or even 80% discount. However, what you will lose here is the SLA. So your virtual machine actually could be requested by another customer, and in that case Azure will go to deallocate your VM and give it to somebody else. So here you have some options for the eviction if that happens and Azure needs to reuse the capacity for reserved by your virtual machine. So you can choose between stop, deallocate, delete, and so on. So there are multiple strategies that you can use. You can also choose how much you are ready to pay for that virtual machine to get reserved to you. So it's like trading to get that virtual machine. And here you can see the cost per hour. Great, I will continue without the spot instance in this demo. And then for the size here, I can view some of the sizes available here, but I can click also see all sizes. And here again, we'll have another surprise. Here actually we have 707 VM sizes. Those VM sizes, we call it also VM family or SKU. Okay, so those will depend on the VM family. So we have the D family, which is the general purpose virtual machines. We have the B VMs, which are the smaller VMs that doesn't consume a lot, and those are some of the cheapest VMs in Azure. We have the E family for the memory optimized virtual machines, and then we have the F family for the CPU optimized, the N series for the VMs that have the capacity for using a GPU. Okay, so we can view some of them here. This VM contains a GPU and so on. So the price also is, as a result, will be a little bit high. For this demo, I'll go to continue with the D series. But with D series, you can view we have actually two families, the V5 and the V4. Okay, that's the version of that series. I'll go for the V5, the latest one as per today. And here we have actually multiple SKUs for those virtual machines. That depends on the number of virtual CPUs available, the RAM available for me, the number of the data disks that I can attach to that virtual machines, and the max IOPS for supported by that VM, the temporary disk if it have any. Okay, and then the support for the premium disk and the cost for that virtual machine. So I'll go to choose here, for example, the VM that have 4 CPU. Let's say that's gonna be the D4DS V5. Okay, so that's 4 CPU and 16 gigabytes of memory. Note that here for this D family and for all the other families, we have the same ratio between the amount of RAM and the number of virtual CPUs. So here the ratio is 1:4 for on 16, so that's 1:4, and the same if I go to 8, that's going to be 8:32. Okay, so that's the same ratio that is provided right here. If you want to change that ratio, then you should go to choose another virtual machine family. Let's say, for example, here the F series or the E series, for example. We can view the ratio here is 1:8. Okay, 1/8. So I'll go back here to the V5 and I go to choose the D4DS. Note here also another important note is that we have two D4. Okay, so this 4 is this number here for the number of the virtual CPUs. Okay, then the numbers after that, those are the characteristics of that virtual machines. Okay, so the more you have the more you have letters here, the more you have more characteristics for that VM. So I'll continue in this demo with the D4DS V5. Okay, at this price, 108.98. So that's almost 200 US dollar. I'll go to select that VM SKU, and then I'll go to provide the administrator account. Now to be able to access that virtual machine, I will go to use username and password. I'll go to provide a username. Let's say that's my name, and then I'll provide here a password, and then I'll go to confirm that password. Great. Then the next section here is for securing or for configuring the inbound port rules. So I configure a public inbound ports. So let's say I want to choose here the port 3389 for accessing to the virtual machine using the RDP protocol. Okay, not here. We have also support for SSH, HTTP, and HTTPS. Okay, I'll continue with that, and then I'll go to the next section for configuring the disks. So here we have actually few options available, either to use the OS disk type. So here I have multiple options for the OS disk. So that OS disk could be locally redundant storage. It means it will be available within one single availability zone. Okay, and it could be also zonal disk or zone redundant storage. This means that disk will be available on all the 3 availability zones for my Azure region. It means I will have 3 copies of that disk within the 3 availability zones. And for each, you would have actually the choice between using a standard HDD, the standard hard drive disk, okay, or to use the latest SSD disk, either with the standard or with the premium disk. So the difference mainly here between those different options is the performance of that disk in terms of I/O operations. So that's going to be the configuration for the OS disk, where I will have the OS installed there. That's my OS, so I want to have the best performance possible. So I'll continue in my demo with the premium SSD. So the OS disk will be actually another Azure resource. Okay, so on the portal I will see my Azure VM, and also I see another resource that is the Azure Disk. Okay, so now when I go to delete the Azure VM resource, I can choose here. I can opt to also delete the OS disk for that virtual machine. By default, it's enabled, so I'll keep it enabled. And then for the key management, I can go to encrypt that OS disk using one of these 3 options, either a platform managed key, so that's a key managed by Microsoft, or I can also, as a customer, I can provide my own customer managed key. So it's up to me to provide that key, and then Azure will use that key to encrypt my OS disk. Or I can use both of them, platform managed key and a customer managed key. I'll continue with platform managed key, and I let Azure encrypt that disk automatically for me. Then I can enable the ultra disk compatibility. This is only available for some SKU. And then I can go to attach a disk for those virtual machines. So for now, we have only the OS disk, but I can also attach another data disk to my VM. I'll skip it right now, but we'll go to configure it later after creating the virtual machine. Next, we would have here another section for the advanced settings for using managed disks or for enabling the ephemeral OS disk, which is available only with some specific disk types. Next, I'll go to the networking section. And here, our virtual machine, as we have seen earlier, actually it should be attached to a subnet within a virtual network, and it should have its own network interface card in order to be to have to be able to access it from that subnet. So for that here, I need to create that virtual network. So either I bring my own existing virtual network, or I can go to create a new virtual network. I'll go to create a new one, and I'll just go to call it VNet VM Windows 11, for example. And I go to assign it 10/16 the address range. Okay, you can change that, of course, if you want to. And then I'll go to create a default subnet for it, and instead of default, I just call it SNet VM, for example. And I give it the address range 10/24, which is within the address range of the virtual network. Once I'm okay for that, I hit the OK button, and that will go to configure that for me. Then I'll go here to configure the public IP. So I want Azure to create a new Azure public IP for this VM. Okay, so I let it configure that for me. Otherwise, I can also use an existing public IP. For the network interface card security group, so this is asking me if I want to bring either my own NSG, okay, so I can do that, or I can create a new NSG, or I can let Azure manage that for me and create a default NSG rule for me. And I can also choose none, and in this case, Azure will not create an NSG rule. I'll go with the basic settings, and then I'll go to configure the public inbound ports. So again, here, as we have done before, actually we'll let access through the RDP protocol. So I enable the RDP there. That network interface and that public IP could be deleted when we delete the Azure virtual machine resource if I enable this option right here. Then another configuration for that virtual machine is to enable the accelerated networks. So that's enabled by default. Let's keep it enabled. We can also configure an Azure load balancer to get access to our virtual machine or to expose a web application, for example, through that load balancer. For this demo, I don't need it, so I'll go straight to the next section for the management section right here, where I can go to first create a system assigned managed identity for my Azure virtual machine. That managed identity could be used to access other Azure services like the database or like a key vault or storage account and so on. And they can also provide or enable the login with the Azure AD to this virtual machine. Instead of using that username and password, I can use my Azure AD credentials to access that virtual machine. Auto shutdown, if I enable this feature, here I can configure a specific time during the day in which Azure will go to shut down automatically my virtual machine. I don't need to enable that feature for this demo. And then we can configure the site recovery. So if I check this one here, we would have additional options for site for enabling disaster recovery, where we can provide recovery services vault to create a backup for this continuous backup for this Azure virtual machine. And then we can enable the orchestration, the patch for those virtual machines, so I can provide it manually, or I can automatically patch that VM and let Azure manage these patches for me. I'll go next to monitoring, and here we have few options. First of all is the alerts. So I'll go to enable this one because this will give me some interesting alerts, like sending an email, for example, or sending me an alert in each time the CPU capacity for my virtual machine go greater than 80%, okay, which is an alerting. It should be alerting actually this value right there. Some other alerts, like for the available memory in bytes. So if I get less than 1 GB of available memory, it will send me an email telling me about the issue that is happening. I'll go to save that config. And next here we can view for the diagnostics settings, or for the boot diagnostics, we can send those logs to a managed storage account. It means that Azure will go to create the storage account and manage it automatically instead of me managing it. Or I can bring my own storage account, and in that case, yeah, I should create the storage account first and use it for that end. We can also enable, so here I go to continue with the managed storage account because that's the recommended option. And then I can go to enable OS disk diagnostics. Okay, so this way Azure will go to get those diagnostics settings, and then it will go to save it to a customer storage account. I don't need this option. And then next I'll go to advanced. And in advanced, we can first start by configuring the extensions. Within virtual machines, we have multiple extensions available. So we have, for example, the agent for cloud workload protection, that's Symantec antivirus. We can also install some GPU driver extension for enabling to use the AMD GPU, for example. Or we can also install the application insights monitoring agent. We can use some other tools like the Azure Pipelines agent, which will go to deploy the Azure DevOps pipelines build agent into this virtual machine. And we have many more, like the custom scripts extension that will allow you to run a script when that virtual machine is installed. For example, scripts that will go to deploy other tools inside this virtual machine. And we have many more of these extensions available, and we can enable them to be to run when we deploy the application. And like the extensions, we have also VM applications. So if I click here, for me, I don't see any, but you should see later some applications that will appear, then you can install it automatically into your VM. We have also the custom data. So this allow you to run a script as part of this custom data configuration. When that VM will run, that script will go to be applied to the virtual machine. Next here we have loads of options available here. I will not cover them all, so I'll go to the next section for adding tags. I will not add tags here, so I'll go to review and create. And yes, here tells me validation failed, required information is missing. So I can view this red tick on the basics, and if I go down here, I see it's asking me to confirm if I'm eligible to use Windows 11 and 10 license with multi-tenant hosting rights. I'll go to check that because here I have the MSDN subscription, and they can use that license to access those features within my VM. Again, here I go to review and create, and for now Azure is validating that configuration that I have specified for that virtual machine, and how we can view all of that config within this view right here. Once the validation passes, I'll go to provision this virtual machine. So I'll go to click the create button, and here Azure will go to create the different resources for my virtual machine. So here it's creating the VM itself, it's creating the virtual network, it's creating the NSG rules, the public IP address, the alert groups, and so on. The creation of the virtual machine will take between 3 to 5 minutes, so I'll pause the video and we'll continue later. Now, once that virtual machine was created and all the resources were created successfully, we can go to the resource group for that virtual machine. And from here, if I expand, I will see actually all of the resources created, like the virtual machine resource itself, the public IP address, the NSG role, the network interface, the OS disk, and the virtual network. So I'll go first to the virtual machine right here, and here we would see the config and the metadata about that virtual machine, like its public IP address, its family size, its SKU, and its operating system type, and so on. We have created an Azure virtual machine and we have enabled RDP protocol to be able to access that virtual machine in Azure. So now I'll go to connect to that virtual machine. So for that, I'll go to the connect option right here and then I'll choose RDP. Note we have also another option for SSH and for Bastion, and we'll go to explore this feature later. But for now, for simplicity, let's go with the RDP protocol. So that we'll go to jump to the connect settings right here, and then I would have the three options here. I'll continue with the RDP. So first, actually, Azure will go to check if my network or my NSG, my network security groups allows me to connect to this virtual machine through its network interface card. So once it checked that I can connect from my IP address right here, it will actually allow me to connect through the public IP address of the virtual machine through the port number 3389. So now I can go to test my connection, or I can go to directly download the RDP file, and that's what I'm gonna do here. So that will go to download that file. I'll go to keep it on my machine, okay, and then I'll go to click on that RDP, and here I'll be provided this window to configure to trust that virtual machine. I click connect, and then next here it's asking me to authenticate to be or to use my credential to connect to that VM. I'll go to expand the options, and here I'll go to use a different account, and from here I need to provide my username and password for that Azure virtual machine. Once I provide those right configuration, I'll go again to trust the certificate, and once that's done, here I'll be presented to this virtual machine where I'm logged in using my username. And here, because that's a new virtual machine, actually Azure will go to ask me to configure that virtual machine. I'll provide the default configuration, and here we have my Azure virtual machine connected into that VM using RDP protocol, and we can go to view the config of that virtual machine. Let's go check the task manager, for example, to view the performance of that VM. So here, if I check performance, I will see, so that's the VM that have 16 gigabytes of memory and does have actually the HDD disk here, and that's the VM using the Intel Xeon Platinum disk or CPU. Now I'll go to the Explorer right here, and I go to this PC, and then I can see that this virtual machine does have actually an operating system installed inside this C drive that contains 126 gigabytes of memory, and the storage here does have actually 149 gigabytes. Note here that this is temporarily storage. It's noted here, temporarily storage, and we might lose this one when the virtual machine gets deallocated or gets recreated. From the Azure portal, we have created a new virtual machine, and we have connected to that virtual machine using the RDP protocol. And now here we are inside that virtual machine where we can view the two disk drive that were created, one for the OS with 126 gigabytes, and the second one that is a temporarily storage disk that should not be used to persist data inside this disk, because that data might be lost, because we might lose this temporarily storage disk. So what the recommendation here is that if you have data to persist, you should create a data disk and attach it to this virtual machine. And we can do that from the Azure portal. So let's explore how that works. So from within my virtual machine brand right here, I'll go to the disks section, where here I can view the attached OS disk already that uses the premium SSD LRS, local redundant storage. And then I can view the section for data disks. For now I don't have any, but I can go to attach an existing disk, or I can go to create a new Azure disk. And in this case here, I go to name it, for example, data disk 01. And then I'll choose the type of that disk to be premium SSD, for example, or standard SSD, and so on. I'll continue actually with the standard SSD, and then the size of that disk, I'll continue with 512 gigabytes, for example, max IOPS, max throughput that will be configured for me, and then I can choose the platform managed key or the mic or the encryption at rest with a customer with the platform key right here. I let Azure manage this for me, and then I can choose that host caching to be read only, for example. I'll continue with this setting for this Azure disk, and then I'll go here to save this configuration. So Azure here in this case will go first to create provision that Azure disk, and then it will go to attach that Azure disk to my virtual machine. So that disk is created, it's called data disk 01. So for that, if I go back to my resource group and hit refresh, here we can view that new Azure disk was created and attached to that virtual machine. If I click on configuration, I will see that config of that disk, and if I go to size and performance, I can view the operation, or I can view the properties of this disk in terms of memory and the disk SKU and so on. And I can change that configuration when I want. Okay, you just need to stop the virtual machine, make the change, and then restart the virtual machine. Let's go back to our virtual machine where we have attached the Azure disk. So here I access through the RDP. So here we can view again only the C and the D drive. We don't see yet the new data disk that we have attached. Okay, it will not go to pop up automatically right here. Okay, so what I need to do here is that go here to this PC, and then I'll choose show more options, and here I will see the option for manage for this VM, and then I'll go to disk management. Then I go to disk management, and from here I can see that here it's showing me to initialize the new disk. So I'll go to click OK, and now I can see that here actually I have an allocated disk with 512 gigabytes of memory. I'll go to click on that, right click, and then I go to select new simple volume, hit next, and then next, and give it an access letter, and hit next, finish. And once the operation finishes, you will see here that disk will be populated automatically right from here. So that's the E disk that would have 512 gigabytes of memory available to be used to persist data into this virtual machine. So we created an Azure virtual machine, and then we have connected to that Azure virtual machine using the RDP protocol, and from there we can view the desktop for that virtual machine. We have some other options like using SSH to connect to that VM using a key, okay? And then a third option that is using the Azure Bastion. Azure Bastion is a secure solution to access the virtual machine, so that the virtual machine will have only a private IP, and that Bastion will go to expose a public IP, but it will add security to access to the virtual machine. So with this solution, my virtual machine will have only private IP. It will not be exposed directly through the internet. So I'm going to use Bastion. So for that, I use Bastion. And with Bastion, we need to create or to configure some configuration right here. So it will take the name of, so actually it will need to figure out the name of that Bastion instance, the resource group where it should be created, the virtual network that will be used or that will allow it to access that Bastion, and then the public IP address for Bastion itself. So I can choose either to provide my own custom configuration, or I can let Azure decide for the default configurations for me. I'll choose this latter option, and I let Azure go to create a new Azure Bastion subnet to host my Azure Bastion. So with that config here tells me that it did added correctly the subnet. So if I go back to my resource group, and then if I go to the virtual network, and if I go again to the subnets, I would see here another Azure Bastion subnet. Okay, it should respect this naming convention, Azure Bastion subnet with dash 26. It means I would have 58 IPs available in here. So that will be the subnet used by Azure Bastion. Then next here, when I refresh the resources, I will see actually I would have many resources, many more resources available, like the Azure Bastion resource itself, or a public IP address that will be used by Azure Bastion. So the provisioning of Azure Bastion itself will take something like 15 minutes as per today. So I'll pause the video and we'll continue after its creation. Now, once that Azure Bastion was created, I can go here to refresh the resources, and clearly I can view that Azure Bastion resource right here. If I click on there, then I should be able to view if there is any session that will connect to the virtual machine using the Azure Bastion. I can view the tier for that Bastion, and I can view the URL for that Bastion that I can use actually to connect to the virtual machines inside the same virtual network. Then if I go to sessions, I will see only the sessions there, and if I go to configuration, I will have some nice config like the tier for this Azure Bastion between basic and standard. So note here already on the config or on the options, there are multiple ones that are disabled because those are using the basic tier. Now, if I go to change the standard tier, they will be enabled. It means I can configure them. So I can configure, for example, copy and paste for the virtual machines. I can configure the native client support. This means it will go to use that native client to connect through the command line, or I can provide or I can enable IP-based connection, shareable link. So that's a link that will be generated in order to connect to this Azure Bastion. And then we have for the scalability, the ability to scale out this or the VMs behind this Azure Bastion resource. So we can go at minimum 2 instances, and we can go up to 10 or 20. I'll go to apply this configuration for now. And here Azure actually is updating the SKU for my Azure Bastion, and again that will take a few minutes. Once that update succeeds here, we can view that now the Azure Bastion tier is the standard tier. Great, now let's go to connect to our Azure virtual machine using that Azure Bastion. So I'll go here to my virtual machine itself, and then I'll go to connect section, and from here I'll pick Bastion, and then I'll use Bastion. And here I would have a section for the connection settings. So I want to use RDP as a protocol. I want to use this default port number, and I want the keyboard layout language or inside the virtual machine to have one of these specified languages. So I'll continue with English US, for example. And then I can define, or I should put here the username for this virtual machine that I have used earlier during the VM creation, and then I should provide the password or a password from an Azure Key Vault instance. I'll go to provide those values, and then I'll pick here the option for opening in a new browser. Once I connect here, pay attention to the blocks that you would have right here. So click allow, always allow pop-ups from this page right here. Otherwise, you will have actually this pop-up that will alert you in case of a problem. So I click connect again, and note here it's opening another window in my Azure, in my Edge browser. I'll go to allow the copy and paste to this virtual machine, and note here I have access to the same VM that I used to access it before, using the RDP directly through the public IP address of that VM. Now I have that access through through RDP and through the Azure Bastion. Within the Azure portal, we have created a new Azure virtual machine, and we have connected to that virtual machine using the Azure Bastion, and that VM now actually uses 16 gigabytes of memory, or of RAM memory. I go to request more memory or more CPU. For that, I need to go to scale out, or actually scale down this virtual machine. That's actually not a scale out typically, but that's a scale up for that VM. If I want to do that, I need to go to the Azure portal, then go to size within the Azure virtual machine, and here I'll be presented again with the different sizes for this VM. Here in my case I have 390 sizes, so I can choose other family VMs, okay, another SKU, totally different, or I can still in the same SKU and they can provide another VM type right here. So I go, for example, for the F series, or the latest E series V5, for example, and then I'll go to use a virtual machine with 32 gigabytes of memory, for example. I'll go select resize. So now it's resizing my virtual machine. And here it tells me that VM was resized successfully. Note here the pop-up that tells me if the VM is currently running. Actually changing the size will cause it to be restarted. Now if I go back to the Azure Bastion access right here, you can see actually really the VM is restarting. And if I go again to the task manager, go to the performance section, I can view the memory now available is 32 gigabytes instead of 16 gigabytes. And for the CPU, we have 2 virtual CPU instead of 4. So that was how easy it is to scale up or scale down a virtual machine SKU in Azure. We have created an Azure virtual machine, and we have scaled that VM. We have attached an Azure Disk. We have enabled access to that VM through using the Azure Bastion. And now maybe we need to stop this virtual machine or delete this virtual machine. So we can achieve that from the Azure portal. When I stop that virtual machine, actually Azure will stop uh, charging back for that VM. So I will not pay for that VM, but I will still maybe pay just for the storage for that virtual machine, because now once it's stopped, it will not consume any CPU or memory. So those resources will be released in Azure. Thus, I will pay so much less for that virtual machine. So I can do that either from the Azure portal, or I can achieve that also using the Azure CLI commands or using PowerShell. So let's see how that works right here. So within the Azure CLI or Azure PowerShell, that's almost the same thing and the same features available in both extensions. So I can first go to start the Azure virtual machine using the CLI commands, or I can go to stop that VM, and I can go also to show the properties of that VM. Let's go to show the properties, for example. Note here Azure will go to generate this command that contains already the name of the resource group, the name of the subscription, and so on. So I'll go to just copy that command, or just go to run that command from the Azure Cloud Shell. So here it did run that command for me, and basically that command actually will go to show this JSON file that contains the properties of the virtual machine, like its name, its region, the config for that virtual machine, the config for the OS profile, the admin user, and of course you don't see the password here, it will be omitted. And then we can view the VM SKU, the configuration for the data disk, the size of that disk, and so on. Great. Let's see now some other config, like for example restarting the virtual machine, or deallocating the VM, or stopping the VM. So here we should have a question. What is the difference between deallocating the virtual machine and stopping the virtual machine? So when we stop a virtual machine, that means it will just stop the VM, but the VM is still there. It's still consuming CPU and memory. Maybe it will not consume, but it will reserve that capacity for it. So it means I will still pay for that VM resources, even if they are not used actually. However, with the allocate operation, that those resources will be released. So my VM will not use any more CPU and memory resources. So in that case, I will not pay for those resources. So the right operation to perform from here is to deallocate the virtual machine. And that's when we have here from the Azure portal this stop operation. This stop actually means deallocate. Okay, behind the scenes, it's really deallocating the virtual machine. But however, from the command line, we have the two options available for us: either to stop, which is for my opinion, not the right operation to perform. If you want to really stop the virtual machine and stop or release the memory and the CPU, so in that case we should use the VM deallocate. So let's go to run that. So I'll go to here. We have, of course, a notification alert for because that operation is dangerous. So if I have a web app running inside, that will means that's going to be an interruption of service. So I'll go to try it anyway. So I'll go to copy that command, and then I'll go back to my command line within the Azure shell, and I'll go to perform that operation. So here it's using AZ VM deallocate, mentioning the resource group, the name of the VM, and the name of my subscription. Note that the name of the subscription is optional. Actually, you can omit it if you have set up the default subscription for your command line. So this operation will take a few seconds, and once it's running, if I go back to my VM config right here, not here, it's running. But if I go to refresh, the state will change here. So for now, it's telling me the status is deallocating, and that stop button is disabled because it's in the stopping process. Let's wait for it for a second, and once it did finish it, actually from here, if I go back to my Azure portal, hit refresh, I can see here stop is disabled, and the only button available for me is to start that VM. So I can restart that VM, and note the status will be now stopped deallocated. Okay, so from here I can go again if I want. I can restart that virtual machine by clicking the start button, and that again will go to change the status of that VM to be started in a few seconds. In this lab, we have created an Azure virtual machine, we have created a virtual network, Bastion, we have created the data disk, we have created the NSG, the public IP addresses, and many resources. Now at the end, if we don't need anymore this virtual machine, we can go to delete it. So there are typically two ways to do it. Either I go to the virtual machine and then I go to delete this VM right here. And remember, because during the creation of this virtual machine, I enabled to delete the OS disk and the data disk when I delete the virtual machine. So those dependent or those dependency resources will be deleted with the VM because they share the same life cycle as the virtual machine. So I can go to delete those data for here, and I can go to apply force delete. So that's let's say the proper way to delete that virtual machine. But note here we have some other resources that are not included, like the Azure Bastion, for example. So if I want to go to delete all the resources created within this resource group, remember the resource group is the logical isolation for applications that shares the same life cycle, for example. So I can go to either delete the entire resource group, and that will go to delete all the resources within that resource group, and that is, let's say, the easiest option, not the cleanest, but the easiest option to deleting a resource in Azure. And I can go to apply the delete to delete it first. To delete it, I need to provide the resource group name that's to not accidentally delete that resource group. So it will make sure that I want to delete it. So I enable that, and then I go to delete. And at this time, Azure will start deleting that resource group for me. So it will go to delete the resources one by one, starting with the one that doesn't have any dependencies for the other resources. So note here we have 9 resources available right here, but then after, if I hit refresh, I will see some of the resources that will be gone. So I lose one resource, and then some other resources get deleted. And here we can view more resources are deleted until all resources are gone. And now Azure will go to delete the last resource, which is going to be the resource group itself. And here it tells me the resource group was already deleted. So if I go to resource groups, here I don't see the resource group that I've created during this demo because it was deleted. Thank you.